Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. One of the most mysterious attributes of sentient beings is the mere reality of being sentient, to have conscious awareness. It's so immediate to our experience that we take it for granted, but it's really the most wondrous and mysterious thing that we do, just the raw fact of having experience, of being conscious. Now, what is that? In Pali, in the Abhidhamma, one of the categories of reality is chitta, which is knowing mind. And when we're thinking and talking about chitta, there are a couple of things to bear in mind so as not to fall into a wrong way of understanding. One is to be very careful around not making it into a thing or an object. There is the knowing, there's the process of knowing, but there is no thing that knows. This is an easy error to fall into because we're forced by the nature of language to talk about conscious awareness in terms of nouns. We have to use, it's a limitation of our language. It would be very cumbersome if we tried to talk about it and avoided the use of nouns altogether. The Buddha said to use conventional speech, but not to be fooled thereby. And it doesn't matter what language we're using, whether it's English or Pali or Sanskrit or Thai or what have you, there'll be a noun that refers to this quality of conscious awareness. In English, probably the closest would be consciousness. In Pali, it's chitta as a technical term in the Abhidhamma. The emphasis on chitta becomes very central in a lot of the Thai forest tradition, particularly with Ajahn Mun and his successor Ajahn Mahabua. There's a lot of talk about the chitta as your true home, often using the Thai word jit, which is also used to mean heart. So sometimes in English translations it'll be heart/mind. Now there's been a long-standing problem or controversy about the understanding of the nature of chitta in Buddhist circles, such that the Sri Lankan Buddhist Publication Society, which publishes a wide range of Buddhist books and pamphlets, won't publish Ajahn Mahabua or Ajahn Mun because they're deemed to be heretical. Their understanding of chitta is not strictly in agreement with the description in the Abhidhamma. In the Abhidhamma, chitta is seen as momentary. There's an object and there's consciousness arising for a moment as part of the process of being, really. But chitta has the role of knowing. When an object arises, the chitta arises taking that object. And the Abhidhamma classifies chitta into 89 categories and types. And the whole approach of Abhidhamma is to see everything as momentary. So the Dhammas, the objective phenomena, momentarily they existent. This is the deep meaning of impermanence, anicca, that they only exist for a moment. And consciousness, likewise, citta arises in a moment, taking the object. Now, on the other hand, in the Thai forest tradition, in one passage of surviving fragments of Ajahn Mun's direct teaching, he talks about citta outside the five khandha, which is the particular formula that the strictly orthodox Sri Lankan Theravadins disapprove of. The idea that there's some part of our being outside the five khandha becomes dangerously close to making a self or a soul, some kind of entity. The five khandha, of course, are body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, the last being vijnana in the Pali. And in the modern Sri Lankan explanations, vijnana is said to be synonymous with citta. Just another way of naming it. Vijnana occurs in the suttas. Citta does not really occur in the suttas, or very, very rarely. Vijnana is the more commonly used term, and it occurs almost always in a few specific contexts. One is the sense consciousness, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, the six senses. So operation of any sense involves the organ of sense, like the eye, the sense consciousness, eye consciousness, chakku vijnana, and the object, the visible form that's seen. So it occurs in terms of sense vijnana, and it occurs in the dependent origination because of ignorance formations, because of formations consciousness. And the explanation found in the explanatory part of the text is that this is referring to rebirth linking consciousness. So it's a very specific moment of consciousness. And the third place it occurs is in the list of the five khandha, the five aggregates, vijnana being listed as one of them. And I'll say just a little bit more important clarification on the rebirth linking consciousness, patisanda vijnana. Again, it's important not to reify this, not to see it as an object or a spirit that travels from one body to another. The Buddha was quite explicit about this point, and he rebuked one monk who spoke in that way. The monk said, I understand this consciousness that arises here is the same one that arises there in the process of rebirth. And the Buddha rebuked him and said, "Oh, foolish man, that you misrepresent my teaching." Consciousness is merely linked by cause and effect. And it can be seen in the Abhidhamma description in that way as being momentary. But then what are we to make of the Ajahn Mun tradition? We talk about vijnana as being the most essential process in terms of a being, and the practice, the meditation practice, is to center oneself in the knowing, in the awareness. That if you're centered in the awareness, then everything is clear. If you're not centered in the awareness, then you're identifying, you're centered in one of the objective factors, like the formations. You're caught in the thoughts or emotions. The knowing process, the faculty of pure knowing, the citta, is difficult to understand because it's so essentially simple. All it does is just be aware. It doesn't judge or discriminate or even really recognize or understand. It's quite separate from thinking or emoting or even perceiving. It's just awareness. It's the purity of being aware of objects. So it can be neither purified nor defiled. It just is as it is. Mhm. Understanding this nature of this process or phenomena is one of the central themes of Buddhist thought throughout history. The Zen tradition makes a great deal of this when they set koans like what is your face before you were born. That's what is your essential nature without any karma or formation. What is just a pure knowing. And the story of the sixth patriarch and his poem. He won the contest to become sixth patriarch when all the monks were supposed to make a poem, a stanza, expressing their understanding of Zen. And the favorite that everybody thought was going to win, he'd written a poem about how the mind is like a bright mirror and reflects all things. And it's our practice to keep the mirror well polished and let no dust settle. And the man who became the sixth patriarch, nobody thought he amounted to much. He was this kind of country bumpkin character, and quite illiterate. They call him in the text ignorant and illiterate southerner. I always like to remember that line when I'm teaching in Tennessee. Get them going. But they say ignorant and illiterate southerner, and he couldn't read the text. He asked somebody, what's that say? Oh, what a lot of rubbish. You write this down. There is no mirror, so where could dust settle, and what need is there for polishing? Yeah. So this is an expression of emptiness. It's something, the void nature of citta, the void nature of everything, but we really fall into error if we try and make the knowing consciousness into a thing of any sort, give it any form or shape. And it's actually very tricky because it is that which knows, so it essentially cannot be known. It's like trying to see your own face. You can never see your own face. I mean, you can look in the mirror and you see a reflection of your face, or a photograph is an image taken of your face, but you can never see your own face directly. It's kind of a metaphor for that this purely subjective cannot become an object. In Tibetan tradition, in Dzogchen, that's the whole central idea of the practice, is to become aware of this quality of pure knowing. They call Rigpa. I've told this anecdote many times that I went to listen to a Tibetan Rinpoche giving a talk on various themes, and he touched on, it wasn't the main theme of his talk, but he touched on Dzogchen and this practice, and he told the students they should make an effort to observe the knowing mind. And in the question period after, I had a question, but I didn't want to ask it because I thought it probably wouldn't look good. It would look, sort of impolitic for a, Theravadan monk to be challenging him in public on it with a question. So I waited till after, and when I had a chance to talk to him privately, and I asked, you told people to look at the knowing mind. Do you think that's even possible? And it was really funny. He kind of hemmed and hawed and spoke around the issue for a while. Then finally he came to the conclusion, actually, no, it's not possible, but it's a really, really good exercise to try. Uh, so when I talk in terms of the Thai forest practice, the way I like to phrase it is to center yourself in the knowing mind. Just let the chitta operate unimpeded. Another angle on this is relating this to Burmese style vipassana. It seems to me that both these practices end up doing the same thing, but approaching it from a different angle. With Burmese vipassana, you're making the effort to be aware of every arising object of consciousness. And the only way you can really do that is if the chitta is unimpeded, if you're just letting the chitta operate. And if you start from the other end and begin with the effort to be centered in the chitta and let the chitta be undisturbed, then you're naturally going to be aware of every object. You can't not be. So when either practice is done to perfection, they end up being identical. But one starts with the object and one starts with the subject. All this so far, in a way, has been kind of a setting the ground, a preliminary, because I wanted to offer another angle on this that I've been thinking about recently that I think might be a way of incorporating both the Abhidhamma approach and the Thai forest approach, reconciling them. In a book on Abhidhamma, I came across a description of the Sarvastivadin understanding of the nature of time. And this is something that's very curious. It's different than the Theravadan. The Sarvastivadin school was one of the early schools of Buddhism, and it was dominant in northern India for a long time. It was the dominant school for ages, and Theravada was actually a small school established in the far south. And it's really only a historical accident that Theravada survived and Sarvastivada didn't, because when the Turks overrun India and suppressed Buddhism, they never got as far as the extreme south or Sri Lanka. So Sarvastivada is a school at least as old as Theravada. It's one of the original 18 schools. And the name means all exists, everything exists. Sarva is like Pali Sabha. Sarvastivadin is all exists, all is. And what that refers to is their idea that past, present, and future all exist. Whereas the Theravada view of time is that only the present moment exists, only has existence. The future is not yet determined and the past has ceased to be. So it seems like a very curious concept, past, present, and future all exist. But there's one explanation of this that I found very intriguing and worth contemplating, is that the present moment is the only moment in which citta exists. Citta is stationary in the present moment, and the dhammas, that is all the objects, everything else in the universe, are moving in a stream from the future into the past, so backwards in time, against the stationary citta. And in each moment, the citta is experiencing those objects that are passing through the screen of consciousness at that moment. Now, it occurred to me that if we think about that model, the citta is both momentary and outside of time. It only exists for a moment, the present moment, and it doesn't move from future to past or past to future. So it only has a momentary existence. But objectively, we experience a stream of time because the objects are streaming from the future into the past. So chitta, which is a term used almost exclusively in the Abhidhamma, is understanding that consciousness in that way as momentary. And vijnana, which is used in the sutta in those three contexts I mentioned, that's the chitta's relationship to the dhammas. It's modes of operation of the chitta as impacted by the dhammas. So I think this is not only an intellectual, philosophical speculation, but I think it's a fruitful exploration of practice. Whether this model is correct or not, to see how it feels and what unfolds if you act as if it were. If in your practice assume the chitta as stationary and the dhammas are impacting on the chitta, and that only this moment is actually real, the chitta only exists in this moment. So reality as we experience it is a relationship between subject and object. And in the future is as yet unfixed, is the field of universal potential. And the past is that which has already been cognized and falls away into memory and layers of old causality. It also has occurred to me, thinking about this, that this model is also quite neatly consistent with quantum physics. That reality exists as a probability field, the wave function, and it only becomes fixed when the observer impacts. So the electron is not found at a point, it's spread out over a fuzzy area that's its probability wave. And it's only when the investigator takes a measurement that it actually becomes fixed at a point. And this is the probability wave is the future unformed existence, the universal potentiality of the future. And when it impacts consciousness, there is a momentary existent, which is the dhammas of Abhidhamma, phenomena that exist only for a moment, a point instant. Then it passes away into the past and becomes a record, a memory. So there's a possibility of seeing things in a couple of different ways. If this fundamental idea of the Sarvastivada is correct, that all exists, past, present, and future, we can either see it as consciousness moving through time as we would move through space. So moving from the past into the future. Or we see the consciousness, the chitta, as stationary. It only exists for this one moment, essentially outside of time. And it's everything else that's moving through past consciousness. It's just as if you're sitting in a train, and maybe all of you or most of you have had this experience. You're sitting in a passenger train in a station waiting to start, and another train beside you starts to move, for a moment you're not sure whether you're moving or the train is moving. And in a sense, it doesn't matter. It's a relative movement. The question is, in the case of a train, the question is which one is moving relative to the track of the fixed earth. But if you were in empty space, it wouldn't matter. There'd be no difference. And this throws a new angle on the often heard injunction to be in the present moment, be here now. However you look at it, it's only really ever the present moment you can be in. But if you think of this present moment as the moment outside of time, the interface between the future coming into birth and the past falling away, and focus your practice on that stillness. The chitta isn't moving. It's still, it's present, and it just becomes a matter of definition whether you see it in the sense of momentary arising or in the sense of that deathless quality outside of time. If you're seeing it in this way, there's no longer really a contradiction between that. It's just two different ways of describing the experience from the point of view, a different point of view.